Dr. Hayes, it's great to be with you.
Awesome to be with you.
So, how did you first start studying the mind?
Well, I was interested in it because, like most psychologists, I was watching a lot of human suffering in my home. I mean, I'm watching my mom and dad have their problems, get in their own way, not know how to get out of their
Hmm.
way. And then soon enough, having become a psychology professor and, uh, you know, stumbled into my own struggles with things, with developing an anxiety disorder. So I've been, interested by watching and then by profession and then by personal struggles. And,
Mm.
I think most people uh, realize how important just how we think and how we understand our role in the world and what's happened to us, what our histories are, and so forth. I don't meet many people who aren't interested in the mind
Yeah,
direct in some way, but I get to have the great joy of pursuing it professionally, and I've done that for about years, 40 some odd, 50 years.
yeah. I had a previous guest on here who said when you meet suffering, you meet your mind. And I think most people start to get interested in their internal worlds by, yeah, by suffering, because then you start to realize, oh, I'm creating perceptions in here. There is this very important internal aspect. It's not just everything that's happening out there.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I sometimes say to people, usually a little cautious about it, the people who really know they have mental health problems, etc., are the lucky ones because everybody suffers.
Yep.
Everybody's has pains. I think suffering is optional. Pain is not. Uh, but if you just rely on normal modes of mind, it'll walk you into cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac. I mean, doing what's logical, reasonable, and sensible is also pathological. It
Right.
just is because the mind didn't evolve to make us happy. It evolved to keep us from being eaten. And those two things are sometimes in contradiction, especially when you start defending your persona as if your life depended on it, or run from your emotions as if your life depended on it. It didn't. You're not going to
Mm.
be eaten by the bear by your in the same way that you'll be eaten by your fears in a way that you'd be eaten by a bear. So it's difficult for us to square that circle of how do we deal with these basic urges to run away, survive, not have bad things happen on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can imagine bad things that have never been that might be, and you can remember anything that ever happened to you that's bad anywhere you go. So right here, right now, you can, feel the most painful thing that's ever happened to you, and you can fear the most painful things that ever will happen to you. What are you going
Mm.
to do with that?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a key point you make, that the mind didn't evolve to make us happy or healthy. It really evolved to for survival and reproduction. And I think that starts to get us into kind of the framework for ACT, for the therapy that you developed. So could you maybe talk a bit about the evolutionary psychology behind how you think about the mind in its modern context?
Yeah, it's kind of a sweet, sad story because I think, if you say that, human suffering comes from the mind, I think what we mean by the mind there is symbolic reasoning, is higher cognition. And, you know, I think the evolutionary story of that initially in the tribal primates that we are, the kind of social monkeys, or not monkeys, but, the social primates that we are. I think it really initially evolved to extend cooperation. If you had to distill down to one single thing that a human baby can do, for example, that predicts whether or not to develop normal language or not, it's being able to derive a bidirectional relationship when you train something in one direction. And that starts with names. I mean, if you know that this is a cup of coffee, you know, even a 12-month-old baby learning this is a cup, if I say, where's the cup, will, try to find the cup by derivation. It takes some training to do that. You don't hop out of the womb doing it. You hop out of the womb prepared to do it. Why would that be important? Well, immediately it extends cooperation. And I think it could come even before there's many language functions at all. There's always been this conundrum, the three things that are special about us are cognition, cooperation, and culture. And most analyses of psychology say, well, it starts with cognition. Or sometimes they say, well, it starts with culture. But I think it starts with cooperation, because that's the multi-level evolutionary force that brings together the centrality of being able to take the perspective of a listener as a speaker. There are lots and lots of non-human animals that will respond to calls and so forth, as well as making calls and so forth, but the parts of the brain that light up are completely different. The prairie dog running away from hearing the eagle squeak, there's a characteristic squeak, is doing something very different than the prairie dog seeing the eagle and squeaking. It's a socially coordinated thing, but that's not true in humans. If I say, what's a metronome? Your brain is lighting up just in that kind of, what is that? In the same way it would be if you named something or pointed to something or spoke about something. So we have these coordinated systems. How did that happen? I think it happens this way. Even non-human babies, even before they develop language, will recognize the importance of cooperation. You can socially reference, you can point, and the baby's eyes will move towards the object you point towards. That's not true with the gorillas. The baby's mother's head has to move for the baby to look there. We can just point to it, we can refer to things to it. We have some theory of mind skills, we have some sort of sense of intentionality, and that's because of the kind of social primates we are. Well, if I then had a characteristic word for something, we're talking about hominins, that before there's the language, but I have just what a chimpanzee would have, let's say, a characteristic hoot when you see a snake. And listening to it, I'm able to respond. Why wouldn't it be if I could come up with within my troop a name for cup and then say cup, that as an extension of cooperation, you wouldn't try to provide it to me. Human babies, if you are playing with them and you point at a toy during the time when you're playing cleanup time with the baby will try to reach for the toy and put it away, put it in a box. If a stranger comes in, gets down, points in the same way, the baby will reach, get the toy, and try to give it to the stranger. So we kind of know what others want even before language. So if I'm saying cup and I can't reach it, why wouldn't a listener reach out, get the cup, and give it to me? Well, here's the issue. When you internalize that, you're now doing something that no other living creature does. 12-month-old babies will give you the bidirectional relationship between a name and an object. We're the only species that does it. The language-trained chimps don't do it. Don't send me an email about your smart dog. You have to train them in both directions, and then they'll do it. Well, once that starts, we're now in a different world, because if I can say this is a cup, then I can also say a name you haven't heard before. You'll look for an unfamiliar object. That happens just a few months later. Very soon, I'm able to do things like, a dime is bigger than a nickel. A dime isn't freaking bigger than a nickel. A chimpanzee can tell you that. They'll happily sort the large objects and the small objects. 3 years old has a hard time doing it. 4 years old, they're wanting the dime. If you can do that, you can say, I know I'm successful, but I could have been so much more. I mean, you're on the road to human misery. So I think, excuse me for the long answer, but I think what an evolutionary perspective gives you is that these adaptations that initially were for one reason get harnessed for other reasons. So initially, socially extending cooperation, which is really important for the kind of cooperative primates we are through language, gets turned into problem solving through language, self-identification, self-story, stories of others, all that kind of stuff, all wonderful, all good, except, even 3-year-olds begin to worry about whether or not other people will like them. 4-year-olds are wondering about whether or not they're lovable. 5-year-olds, am I smart enough? I mean, I'm doing 3, 4, 5 just kind of in an arbitrary way. I'm just saying, you think about how old you were where you first start wondering if you're really good enough, smart enough, lovable enough. Man, you're a little one. You're really small, because it doesn't take very much. And by the way, 6-year-olds commit suicide. They do. Only among humans. We're the only ones, because we can say, I'm not good enough, or I'll be happier when I go to heaven with mommy if mommy just died. So you were able, with just a little bit of here as our events with their attributes, before and after an evaluation in your mind, you can solve problems and you can create problems, including one, the most severe one we can imagine evolutionarily. We can leave the planet by our own hand with just that much cognitive ability. So it's a wild tiger that we're riding.
Yeah, certainly a blessing and a curse. And this machinery of suffering that you described can be so helpful. I mean, look where it's gotten us in material circumstances, but then, as we're aware, some of the people who have the best material circumstances are often the least happy. And we're not seeing things as they are, as you pointed out. Like, we're seeing things and then immediately labeling them with our beliefs and contextualizing them and layering on top all these thoughts, comparing ourselves to others. It really became the first time I became aware of how much of my mental software is devoted to socialization is when I went on a month-long meditation retreat, and you're just watching 95% of your thoughts are, oh, that meditator over there is kind of cute. And, and then, oh, that person who keeps using the bathroom in my room, they're so rude. I can't believe they would do that. Just projecting your stuff on other people. And that's just most of your brain is thinking, it's never, it's always socialization and relations to other people. It becomes obvious.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's this kind of social baseline. We're carrying a group with us all the time. There's an entire community sitting here in this conversation between you and I, of our past, but also our projected verbally, who's going to listen to this podcast and who likes it. And, oh, by the way, when is my wife coming home? And, just on and on it goes. We're in this social context, even when we're all by ourselves, because that social extension of perspective taking, that starts with non-verbally, oh, you sweet baby, your brain lights up just with the contact of loving eyes from adults. But, now we can have both loving and unloving eyes kind of following us mentally with our thoughts. And what you said about, even the most success, which comes out of the same exact ability, it's not a different ability. It's the same exact verbal, analytic, problem-solving ability, is true. What the ACT stuff has done is to try to do the hack of figuring out even what is cognition, what is the mind, what does it work, how does it work? But then also, what are the ways that this evolutionary mismatch happens, where you have learning processes that are 500 million years old, go back to the Cambrian. We know that because every species that evolved then does operate in classical conditioning. They all do association, they all do learning by reward, every single one of them, none before. So there's a dividing line. It's part of why there is a Cambrian explosion, because then you can seek out special niches, sources, etc., and the evolutionary pressure changes. But now we have this recent kid on the block that's got to be more recent than when we split off from the chimpanzees, because they don't do it. I mean, if you go to Yerkes or whatever and you try to get them to, learn it in one direction, derive it in two, chance level respond, chance. So, and there's like 30 years of effort to try to get. I come out of the animal learning tradition. I'm a behavior analyst guy, and there's a 30 or 40-year effort to try to make pigeons, rats, chimpanzees, etc. do it. And they just won't do it. They will
And
not.
you're referring to theory of mind?
Yeah, it's more than theory of mind. It's the ability to derive a mutual relationship and put it into combinatorial networks that change the functions of the events that are in that network.
Okay.
So that if you just know a few things, like if this, then that, and the this and that have features, and then you can evaluate, let's say, well, that's better than this. You've got problem solving. You've got these relations of before and after. That's a bidirectional relation. If something's before, something that's after, well, then with regard to the after, that other thing is before. It goes in both directions, right? It's not symmetrical in a literal way, but it's mutual. And all verbal relationships are like that, but then they combine into networks very, very rapidly. And, you know, the explosion that happens with language in children, so much of that is on their own doing, deriving relationships by exclusion. You know, I don't know the name of this, so I assume it must be that, you know, that kind of thing, and then combining it. So you learn it in one, you derive it in two, you put it into networks, and it changes what you do. That's the little ditty that covers 40 years of research on relational framing. But once you're there, you're in a completely different world. And the hack is, how does that evolutionary recent adaptation that started with cooperation, then turned into problem solving, clash into ancient processes that are in the area of learning 500 million years old, but even earlier habituation, but even earlier, of course, because you've got basic biological functions that are there that are not based on learning. And that's a train wreck, because you can so easily do what your problem-solving mind tells you to do that's unwise. And take that example of the rich person who's miserable. Anybody who's feeling badly about themselves, or they're insecure or something, wouldn't you want to feel better? Of course you would. Wouldn't you want to feel good about yourself? Of course you would. Wouldn't you want to be included in the group? Well, that's really basic. That's the kind of primates we are. Okay, apply your problem solving to that. I'll get rid of the bad feelings. I'll convince other people that they need me because I'm special. You just do those two things, you're headed towards misery. Because as you try to push feelings away that are, quote, negative, you're pushing wisdom away, because lots of those negative feelings bring in things that are important about your context and history. For example, people close to you are going to die. You think you're going to feel great about that? Why don't you just push that away? You know, if you push that away, you got to push intimacy away. You got to push closeness away. You got to push love away, because love and loss comes as one thing, not two. We don't live forever. And people betray us, they let us down. Things happen. They die. Well, so, you know, this sensible thing, I just want the good stuff, turns into this suppressive thing. I want to run from the bad stuff. And you can't run fast enough. The billionaire who's, you know, getting all the self-aggrandizing things happening and people falling around telling me he's wonderful, it's so hollowed out. We actually, there's data on this. If you have more money than other people put in the service of feeling better about yourself, it predicts suicidality, depression, and anxiety.
Wow.
Because you're doing something the mind cannot do. You cannot suppress your way into happiness. Nobody's been able to do that, ever. You're constantly on the lookout for, you know, what might come that will break down the suppression. Well, that's not happy.
Yeah. Well, you've said a couple of things there that I think are counterintuitive. The first is, you said earlier, way at the beginning of our conversation, that there's a difference between suffering and pain. And I think that's related to what you just said, that you don't want to push away negative feelings, because most people, that's the initial reaction is, I don't want to feel this way. How do I not feel this way? How do I feel somewhere? How do I feel some different way? So how does that relate to ACT and your therapy?
Well, what's inside ACT is a collection of processes that challenge these logical, reasonable, sensible, and pathological things that we do, to get entangled with our thoughts, avoidant of our emotions, to disappear from what's present right here, right now, into ruminating about the past or worrying about the future, to buy into the self stories and the stories of others, instead of catching that there's a whole of us that includes those stories but isn't fully defined by them, and that there's this witnessing, noticing, more spiritual and aware part of us that, by the way, connects us in consciousness to others, that goes all the way back to that first moment of mama looking at you in your eyes, you know, the human connection that consciousness affords. And take those processes and find a way to be emotionally open, cognitively aware, but with a little bit of perspective, focused on the now from this more witnessing, spiritual, noticing, pure awareness sense of self, and focus on what are the qualities you want to put into your actions, your
Mm.
actual, where the rubber meets the road moments. What do you want your behavior to instantiate, to reveal as qualities? Not rewards, not goals, those are fine, but that's in the future. I'm talking about what are you doing right now in the service of what? Are you behaving lovingly? Are you behaving genuinely? Are you behaving creatively? I don't know what the Lee is you want, but whatever it is, whatever those qualities are you aware of them? Are you focused on them? And now are you building habits around them? So I just said 6 things. Turns out those 6 things are really 3 things: the being open, aware, and actively engaged. And those 3 things collapse into one thing. We call it psychological flexibility. That's an empirical fact, just psychometrically, and we try to measure it. It's 6 facets. It's like a box. There's 6 facets of a box, 6 sides, but you put them all together and it makes the box. You take them apart, you don't have the box. So it's 6 things that are one thing. And that's like psychological flexibility. Well, it's a hack in the sense that it's only about 15, 20% of the evidence or the process-based evidence about the mind that's out there in the literature, maybe even smaller. But it encompasses more than half of the evidence on the processes of change. And if you get more flexible, this is a study that we have coming out of the next year where we looked at every single study that ever looked at processes of change with a psychological intervention, every single one ever done on the planet for anything that had a psychological outcome, right? And the psychological flexibility processes I just named can account for about 80% of the variance in the processes of change that lead to positive outcomes. So suffering and pain is an example. Suffering itself says the name. Suff means up and under. That's a prefix that means that. And the fur part comes from the same root as a ferry boat. It means to carry. Ferrying, okay. And it has that metaphor of you're up and under and carrying the weight. Put it down, dude. The pain will still be there, but you have an option as to whether or not you're going to carry this heavy weight as if life begins when you subtract enough pain. You can't, A, there's no delete button in the nervous system. B, you can't suppress and subtract fast enough to stay ahead of it, because it creates problems when you do that. So let's learn a wiser way of being open, aware, and actively engaged. It's in our wisdom traditions, our mindfulness traditions, our spiritual traditions, our deep clinical traditions, our cultural traditions, and it's just hidden inside, commercial culture and a whole lot of unwise things being promoted by YouTubers and Instagram posts that look great on the outside, and then you find out the person's using drugs, and then, by the way, they committed suicide. What's going on the inside of all that happy, joy is not what it looks like. And your insides, you see other people's outsides. So it's time for a little more honesty. It's hard to be human.
I like how ACT is something that is not, even though it's being used often in the context of treating a specific disorder, it's something that anyone can learn. So I was wondering if you could walk us through maybe just the basic beginner steps as to how someone would start to implement that as a tool.
Okay, I'll give you several things you can do. There's a TEDx talk where I walk through these. I have 12 methods there that I walk through quickly, teaching them to in a school where people have to have an IQ that's 99.9% percentile, the Davidson Academy. So they're brainiacs. And by the way, they still have lots of mental health problems, even more than some others, because they're thinking too much. So take a negative thought that's focused on you. Distill it down to a single word. Say it out loud for 30 seconds rapidly, at least once per second. Sing it. Say it in a funny voice. Whatever the bottom line conclusion is, spell that word backwards when you say it. Uh, uh, Imagine it being told to you in the voice of your least favorite politician. Imagine you, when you first started struggling with self-judgments, meeting yourself at that age. Take some time to imagine yourself and have that child you imagine say that thought out loud in his or her little voice. Give your mind a name. Call it by category. Something that the late Baba Ram Dass promoted. I'm having the thought that. I'm having the evaluation that. I'm having the feeling that. Just call it in your sentence. Don't just say I'm bad, saying I'm having the evaluation that I'm bad. You know, when we put people in imaging, fMRIs, et cetera, with these kind of methods, your brain lights up in a totally different way. You think you're just the victim of all this self-talk, self-evaluation. No, you're the author of it. So author it in different ways, play around with it. And these kind of paralinguistic methods, contextual methods, create a depression opera. I have some of these apps, you can take a difficult thought, put it into your iPhone, and it will sing it back to you, your favorite rap song or whatever it is you like. Man, it's just going to land differently. It's not ridicule. Don't be thinking I'm telling you to make fun of yourself. That's why I included that one, a picture yourself as a young child. And I say that I'm asking you to realize that your thoughts are an instance of thinking. And you don't have to, since it's thinking, it's you doing. You're not a victim. There's a response in here. And you have the ability to do it differently. In other words, you're response-able. You're responsible. Started with 2 words, became responsible. You are responsible for your thinking. But it's so grooved and habitual, and there's no delete button in the nervous system. If you've had your mother saying, here, blah, 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 you're going to carry that to your grave. So, but if you can say it in the voice of Donald Duck, it's not going to land exactly in the same way. What you were mentioning earlier, that kind of sense of broadening that happens as you revisit these things in meditation. What's going on there is literal language narrows our repertoire to the literal meaning of the words. All the things I just mentioned, and there's about 200 other methods in the ACT world, and I teach people how to develop them. So people send it to me from around the world of cool things they've come up with. They print their difficult thoughts on baseball caps and, just all kinds of crazy ass stuff. But as that happens, what's happening is now we're expanding the repertoire when you have a particular thought. There's many things you can do with it. You could sing it, you could share it, you could say it in a silly voice. You can deliberately do the opposite. There's another one. Take a thought, distill it down that tells you what to do. A person listening to me right now could do it. Get a really clear thought in your mind, like, I can't pick up this cup. Get it really clear in your mind, and then pick it up. You just broke a rule. We have studies showing if you do just that, your ability to withstand pain has gone up like 50% in about 2 minutes.
Wow.
This is why it's important in things like sports and stuff, because people are having, they have that wall that they hit. For example, if you're a runner, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. If you know how to break the rule and let Mr. Mind tell you what to do, but you still do what, you thank your mind very much for trying to help you with the marathon, and you run through the wall.
Yeah, I was reading recently that they used to think that there was a physiological break where the muscle just built up enough lactic acid or whatever and couldn't go further. And then they realized that the breaks are actually in the mind, and the mind will stop you so much well before you would have gotten injured or whatever.
Well, and this thing, the mind, what happens is this evolutionary recent adaptation is harnessing neurobiological systems that are 1,000 times older. In such a sick way, it almost makes you mad. Do you know I'll give you an example. This narrative self, where you take this conceptualized processes we're talking about, and now you apply it to yourself. I'm a person who. It's very similar to this thing of breaking through the wall. I can't do that because then also turns into I'm a person who, and whether it's great and grand or sad and pathetic, in either way, we now have built a cage that we're going to live inside, right? Well, what that begins to harden is these midbrain structures that function as gatekeepers for sensory motor information as to what's going to be passed off, where connectivity is going to be fostered or inhibited within the brain. It does the dirty business of actually filtering out contradictory sensory motor information that doesn't fit your narrative. And how do we know that? Well, ACT is being used very strongly right now as a structure for doing psychedelic therapy, and there's really good fMRI studies with what happens with psychedelics. It's a little harder with meditators and so forth, so much practice and so forth. There's a really neat preparation that's in there with psychedelics. Let's be careful. I don't want to relive the 60s. I did it once. I'm old enough to have seen it. Let's not do that train wreck again. But is there something important in there? Yes, there is. And what happens is you are actively, because of your narrative self, harnessing these midbrain structures that start literally filtering out sensory motor information. You can be in a context where if you're an unlovable person, where somebody is saying something so loving and caring, and you literally almost don't sense it, you almost don't hear it.
Wow.
It doesn't make it to the decision-making processes of your brain. It's filtered out, it's gone. It's like, the world we live in is not even the world we live in. At the basic level of sensation, it's like, God, make it stop. Meditators, etc., you can see they start opening up some of those pathways. You have more attentional flexibility. You can do it in detection tasks and things of that kind, which is another flexibility process of learning how to attend more broadly.
So they're actually teaching ACT as a tool before someone would take a psychedelic in a therapy session?
Exactly. In the randomized controlled trials of psychedelics, what they're doing is they use ACT. And it's not the only one, but it's becoming the dominant one. If you just look at the major research centers that are out there in IU and Toronto and San Francisco and so forth, with the big funded trials, really done well. The nice thing about funding isn't just that, I got a grant, but no, there's so many controls and stuff that really means that this is serious. It's a serious problem. These are serious researchers. This isn't woohoo, drop some acid. This is something that has a chance to really change things. And you need a rationale. You can't just throw chemicals at people. I mean, it's not the chemicals that's doing it. In indigenous societies, all of which have psychedelics as part of it, there's a mission, there's a purpose, there's a reason, there's a rationale, there's a structure, there's a ritual, there's a ceremony, there's a safety net, there's something, there's all these social and cognitive and cultural wraparounds. Well, we can't go back and, get the medicine man into Western culture to do that for us, but we could bring in evidence-based psychotherapy. So what they do is walk through, values, acceptance, diffusion. What I was just doing is sort of stepping back from your cognitive processes and watching them. The neologism that we use in ACT is diffusion. Attentional flexibility, this sense of self, of just witnessing and noticing. Well, there's really good evidence now that that is supportive of the psychedelic work. B, when psychedelics work, and they have pretty good trials with pretty amazing effect sizes, with pretty dug in problems of PTSD, depression, things of that kind, the people who improve almost universally say, and the measures show, they're showing greater experiential openness, less experiential avoidance, a sense of oceanic awareness, connection across time, place, and person, changes in perspective taking. These are all central to the ACT model. And So you can really say it this way: the psychological flexibility mediates the outcomes of psychedelic therapy, and even if you're not using ACT as a rationale, uh, because that's just the way we're organized. I mean, in the same way that parents were always good at reinforcement, good parents, they didn't need reinforcement principles to do it. They just did it. In the same way, effective therapists have been helping people become more psychologically flexible from the beginning, but not just that. Our wisdom traditions, our cultural traditions, in a way, we all know it. We know it, but our mind doesn't know it. Our
Yeah.
problem solving mind doesn't know it. I can actually convince you of that in a matter of minutes if you want me to do it. It would
Yeah.
be relevant.
Sure.
It's relevant because I've only given you an example of some diffusion and quick extensions to conceptualize self, attentional flexibility, but these 6 flexibility processes we won't have time to go through. But here's a project that we're about to put out for publication, where we just went around the world and we said to people, think of a psychological problem that you have. Don't tell us what it is. All right. Now, show me with your body, you at your worst with that. Imagine that your body is the result of a sculptor and you're the sculptor. Just put your body in a position. We're going to take a picture with the camera here, whatever you want to do. Okay. And I'm seeing you do it. Very awesome. Awesome. And then how about put your body in the position of you at your best with that same issue. Don't tell me what the issue is, but it's the same issue. All right. And what you just did, you clenched your fist as if it's going to be a fight. You lean back a little bit rigidly as if you had to defend yourself for an attack. Yeah. Ready to fight and to attack. Often people will you wouldn't do it here because the context doesn't fit it, but they'll close their eyes and their heads will come down. They may bend at the waist and bring their knees up. They're going to show something that says fight, flee, fail, flop, defend, some set like that. Conversely, when you're open, your head comes up, your eyes are open, often your arms and hands will go out, like I'm here, I'm ready to engage. I'm ready. Well, these are the flexibility processes. Open, aware, and actively engaged. If you want just 3 ways of saying the 6 processes, you'll show it with your body. I'm more open. Literally, we do measures of how far away are your arms and limbs from your trunk. When we look at these pictures, we have them scored by folks without them knowing which is it, because there's 2 pictures, but they're all mixed together. We've got several hundred of them around the world. And we could ask questions. Is this picture open? How much? Is this picture actively engaged? How much? Is this picture reveal awareness? How much? And in every culture around the world, human beings will show you in a very clear, dramatic way that they already know that being open, aware, and actively engaged is more successful, and being closed down, defended, fighting, fleeing, and not engaged is less effective. And yet, what is your mind going to tell you to do? If you suddenly start panicking right now in this podcast, it's going to tell you to make it stop.
Right.
That's what it's going to tell you to do. Well, that's a good pathway, I can tell you, as a panic disordered person in recovery, towards what we call panic disorder. If you had a
Self-reinforcing.
if you had a weird thought, like maybe I should, say a curse word right now. Maybe I should put porn on my background screen. I mean, I get emails every day. I took on one this morning from a guy who's having obsessive fears of exactly that kind of stuff. I mean, your mind will give you an invitation. And what was the guy emailing me about? How do I make it go away? Dude, that's OCD. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Everybody has weird thoughts. It's actually in here, step on a crack, you break grandmother's back. We did it as little children. Once we get language, there's a magic. Maybe we can do magical harm. Well, that's really close to OCD, isn't it? And we go through that phase, and most of us walk out, but some of us don't. And driving over the bridge, maybe I should jerk the wheel and fly off into the, You want to turn that into OCD? Make it a focus of elimination.
Mm,
You're on that pathway. So these natural temptations that are there in the human mind
mm.
are shared by us all. And to some degree, we're all mishandling it. None of us is the Dalai Lama. But probably the Dalai Lama is not the Dalai Lama. You know, he says he still gets so upset sometimes. And he's been meditating for 55 years or whatever. But can we do better? Yes, we can do better. And the Western science hacks, I think, can be of some help.
Yeah, acceptance is so powerful, and it's really across different psychological methods, whether it's psychedelics or negative emotions, or even recently I've been getting into lucid dreaming, where if you encounter in your dream, if you become conscious that you're dreaming, you encounter a nightmare, the first thing you're supposed to do is turn around and face it. And, if it's a scary monster, if you give it a hug, it'll just transform into a whimpering little child. And then you wake up feeling like you worked through some psychological material. So learning to accept the little mini selves in our heads, basically, instead of running away or suppressing them, it's very counterintuitive, but makes a lot of sense with all sorts of different psychological methods.
There's a new book I've written on psychological flexibility, is summarizing that 40 years of work and all the different places it goes, from mental health issues to the Olympics. I tell the story of my hitting bottom inside my panic disorder and having it come to me, something that I learned in a lucid dream when I was like 6, 7, or 8,
Oh, wow.
which is, I called it running towards the dinosaur, which is I used to have these dinosaur dreams and they would come in big, gigantic Tyrannosaurus Rex eyeballs would be up against the window, and I'm hiding. And eventually it was just too much and I had to run, and I would leave the house and I'd run no matter how fast my little feet would go. It was one of those running dreams. The dinosaur, was even faster. And I'd turn this way and that, but the creature from the Jurassic was right on my rear end. And finally it would bite me and then I'd wake up. And so somewhere in a lucid dream, it came to me, when it bites me, I'm going to wake up. Maybe I should run towards it. And I turned and ran towards the dinosaur, jumped in its mouth and woke up. And then I started doing that more often. I had enough lucid dreams. I just thought that was what, and within, a few weeks or something, the creatures from the Jurassic, turns out, don't like that game. They, they only want to chase. They don't want me to. It's not fun just to eat me. So somewhere in the bottom of my panic disorder, if you want to see it, look at my TEDx talk. I turn, and in the middle of the night, thinking I'm having a heart attack, but I'm just having another panic attack, which I don't realize at first. Literally saying out loud, you can make me suffer, but you can't make me turn away from my own experience. And I'm talking out loud to that voice within, that dictator, that dinosaur that's pushed me into running and running and running and running to the point that I couldn't give a lecture to 5 undergraduates. And I'm an untenured assistant professor. This is like death. This is doom. I'm going to lose my entire career. And somewhere in there, thank God for panic disorder, I kind of hit a bottom where I found something that it was in my own experience. I know how to run towards the dinosaur when I was 8. Well, just do it. And and I knew something about it from Hippie Hill. I knew something about it from psychedelics. I knew something about it from Baba Ram Dass and from Timothy Leary and from Esalen and from, Joshu Sasaki Roshi and from, D.T. Suzuki and from Alan Watson. I'm an old dude. I'm there when all that kind of stuff is happening. And I'm trying to do CBT and exposure to relaxation tapes. And what I needed to do, nothing wrong with those things as part of it, but what I needed to do was do what an 8-year-old knew how to do, which is run towards the dinosaur. And I've spent my next 40 years learning how to do that. I'm still not perfect at it. Ask my wife. But teaching other people how to do that. If you really want a specific thing about what ACT is, that's it. It's learning how to run towards the dinosaur. And once you've done all that, remembering that you came here to do something. What do you want to do? What do you want your life to be about? If you're not running away, what's it going to be about? It's up to you.
That's beautiful. Well, I want to make sure, do you have time for a couple of rapid fire questions?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so these are just kind of, I've got four of them for you, and they're just kind of quick answer
Sure.
questions. So your favorite psychologist?
Oh gosh, I'm a Skinnerian. B.F. Skinner is my favorite psychologist. A flawed human being in some ways. I knew him, spent time with him. Wrong in some areas, but oh my God, right in so many.
Do you think his
Uh,
utopian vision of Walden 2 would work out?
I really think that's our task as human beings. And the fact that this rat runner early on writes a utopian novel, he's not saying I have the answers. He's saying this is the question we need to answer. And man, that is what made me a behaviorist as a high school student. I was a humanist and Abraham Maslow, high peak experiences and all that kind of stuff. But what made me a behaviorist is this idea that we could go with Western science from rats to Walden 2. And are we there yet? No, we're not. But if
Mm,
you come and look at the ACT group, we have this little thing. Here's our challenge: creating a behavioral science more adequate to the challenge of the human condition.
mm,
So I don't giggle or sneer at utopian stuff. To me, that's the human heart yearning for a world that's better. And you see it right now inside Black Lives Matter and what's happening around the world. Man, enough of what we're doing with this selfish stuff that's going to
mm.
make the world unlivable. How about using our scientific side and our wisdom and traditions and so forth to really change human culture in a way that supports people living whole
Mm.
and meaningful lives.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love how you also bring evolutionary psychology into it as well. So it's not just like raw behaviorism, like we're blank slates. It's more like, all right, we come with this predisposed evolutionary psychology, and then but within that, there's a lot of operant conditioning. And I agree with you. I think
Yeah,
we could design.
I so much agree with that. And we have a special issue of clinical clinical psychology review, highest impact clinical psych journal out there on clinical psychology and evolutionary science. I've published a couple books with my colleague David Sloan Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist of note, especially known for multi-level selection. And we've tried to apply this. We have a book called Pro-Social that makes it act with Eleanor Ostrom's core design principles for small groups that we're putting into things like the COVID crisis or the Ebola crisis in Africa. We put pro-social into Sierra Leone. So I'm actively trying to think of how we can scale the best of behavioral science knowledge with the best of biological knowledge inside the queen of the theories of life science, which is evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
To me, that gives us a way forward in terms of cultural development and personal development, because you can evolve yourself on purpose. It's not la la land. No, no, no. You're not going to do, childhood end and then we float off the planet into the, I'm not talking about some sort of woo woo level of evolutionary science, but
Mm.
once you know the principles of variation, selection, retention, and context at these different dimensions and levels, you can evolve your own psychology and your groups you're in and the culture. And inside that, let's see what happens, even in terms of our biological phenotypes over time.
Yeah.
Uh, but at least we can do the epigenetic regulation of some of the excesses. If I can give you an example of that, meditation, you probably know these data.
Yeah.
8 weeks of meditation, you turn on or off around 7% of your genome through epigenetic regulation, mostly of stress-related gene systems to the extent that we know what they do. That comes out of Herb Benson's work with essentially demystifying TM.
Mm.
15 minutes of meditation, about 2% of your genome changes.
Right.
So, you are not a passive recipient of your genetic inheritance. So you're actively regulating your genes right now. In this conversation, we're doing that.
I've already mentioned a lot of things, but I get something you believe that most people wouldn't agree with.
I don't believe that what we see as we interact in and with the one world is the world.
Mm.
I don't believe our perceptions correspond with the world. I'm with the Donald Hoffmans of the world that says evolution itself will create hacks for interacting in and with the world that do not correspond in any sense of the term correspond to the real world. And what that means is we don't see the snake, we see the aspect of the one that keeps us from getting bitten and dying. And think of it like the movie The Matrix. If we're really living into cascading green letters, it would be a lot easier to think of it in a different way, in the same way that right now we're interacting through a machine that has billions of bits being moved around right now in your machine, my machine, and all the connections. Do you want to know about that? No. I want to know where the button is to share the screen, or where the little trash can is to drag the file. Does that mean the file is blue in a rectangle and that it goes into a trash can and has a place that's up in the right corner? No, it's an interaction. It's an interface. We don't know where the file is. In fact, to even think of the file being somewhere is a mistake. And it doesn't have color. It doesn't have shape. But I want an operating system that gives me that. I don't
Yeah.
want to have to interact with the matrix in the same way. So even some of my evolutionary colleagues, David Sloan Wilson and I, are on about a 10-year-long conversation about this. And he's down with, variation selection, meaning, contingencies are critical, but he really wants facts. And he'll probably listen to this, so I'm saying, sorry, David. He kind of wants facts that correspond. And I'm sorry, but I can't give it to you. There are things called facts in the sense of the ways of speaking that are so fundamental and shared across people that it's a useful thing to call them. But don't get deceived even by your eyes. You're not seeing the world. You're interacting in and with the one world. That's different. It's real, but not what you see is real. And once you're there, here's the great liberating thing. Get clear on your purposes. Get clear on what moves you there. That's how evolution works with life and death issues having to do with genetic, epigenetic variation. We can do the same darn thing with our values, with a culture, with the kind of world we want to create. Get clear on what the outcomes are. How do we select and retain to that? Let's put in healthy variation and retention processes that are contextually situated. And let's not argue about, is it real, or do this other thing. The reason why this was helpful is because it was real, and now you're captured by your words. And your words are so inadequate. Every scientific theory, given enough time, has been shown to be false.
Right.
Every one. So let's assume that they're all false in some way. Hold them lightly, pursue them vigorously, use them when they're useful, and when they're not, learn how to put your mind on a leash and leave it behind.
Yeah, I think about them as all just maps, and they all rely on axioms, and we can just make better and better maps for basically improving the human experience, but we can't, just to call any of them true would be unscientific. I mean, because they all do rely on assumptions that are always getting improved upon. And the theory,
Exactly. So take that one little step. So when you say, are they maps of something? I'd say they're maps in and with everything.
right? Yeah, and the theory that you mentioned of consciousness, Donald Hoffman, for folks who are interested, want to look that up. It's called the multimodal user interface theory. And I was going to mention that as soon as you said that our perceptions aren't real. It's just the most logical theory I've heard as to our conscious experience of the world, because there's a vast tangle of information out there that we wouldn't have evolved. It would be energetically impossible for us to perceive if there is an actual objective reality of just a vast tangle of information. We're getting such a thin sliver of that so far as it was useful for our survival and reproduction. So if essentially what the theory is saying is we're just interacting with icons, like you said,
Exactly.
icons on a
Well,
desktop.
and the wonderful humility that comes from that. If that would just get into hardcore science, because we, soft core sometimes is there. We'll speak that way. Social constructionists, etc. Some of that goes crazy, goes woo woo. I get that, but there's a piece of it in there that's right. If we could get it into the hard sciences, especially in the hard wings of behavioral science, it gives us that little bit of humility of let's not argue about what is in capital letters or T, capital T truth. Let's look at what are our goals and are we accomplishing them? And then let's get together as a human community and use the diversity of theories, models, principles, processes, but held to account to the bottom line of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And that's, we call it functional contextualism in ACT. That's the philosophy of science that's under ACT. It's essentially a radical pragmatism, but a kind of pragmatism that isn't what feels good does it. It doesn't have the downsides of pragmatism, because we can be specific about our goals aspirationally, and we can hold ourselves accountable to it. That gives us a way around it. And what has happened to me in doing that is I can talk to people who have very different ideas. My closest colleague right now is a guy named Stefan Hoffman, who's a traditional CBT person. And I'm a third wave kind of mindfulness person. And we were initially opponents. We'd have like debates, and people would come by the hundreds to watch these knockdown drag out fights 15 years ago. Now we're best buds and we're doing work on process-based therapy. Do we agree? No, we still don't agree. But we have that little core of that's okay, because we're not arguing about what's true. We're just looking at how to accomplish useful ends. And that more evolutionarily focused but humble thing of now take that last step. Donald's book, The Case Against Reality, his recent book that just came out, which, by the way, I sent him a little thing showing, did you notice that if people buy ACT books, they buy your book? He didn't respond. He didn't know. He probably thinks I'm some weirdo, but which I am. But I just thought this is so awesome. I also told the story of, and you're really helping me in my argument with David Sloan Wilson. I'm sure he knows David's work. So, but yeah, I love the book, The Case Against Reality. He doesn't really mean that there is no real world. He's not saying that. Right. It just means let's not get hooked by capital T truth. It doesn't exist.
Understanding that theory makes you want to be so flexible in your beliefs, because you recognize that, we really don't know anything. So we're just taking in new information that should inform our beliefs that can constantly create a better model of the world, create better systems.
We're just talking down here, gang, and let's talk in ways that are effective. And scientific talk based on evidence is one of the most effective ways we've ever figured out how to do in Western civilization and civilization across the world.
So last question for you is, if you have a 15-second commercial that goes out to the whole world, what would you say in your message?
I'd say it's okay to be you. Show up to what your history is, but focus on what's important. And let a little bit of your insides be more on the outsides, because there's other people who are feeling just like you.
Nice, beautiful. Well, listen, thanks so much for coming on and discussing these important topics, and showing us that we don't have to believe everything we think, and showing us some tools that we can use to better train our minds. And where can folks find your work if they're interested in learning more or connecting with you?
If they want to get on my email list and get newsletters and stuff, I don't spam people, but if you ever felt like you didn't want it, someone click opt out, just go to Stephen C. Hayes, Stephen with a V, middle initial C, Charlie's my middle name, Stephen C. Hayes, Hayes, no periods, just all one word, .com. And right there on the screen, it'll say, yes, please send it to me. And if you click on it, you'll get that. But I would also orient you towards A Liberated Mind, my most recent trade book. It came out in paperback only a week ago when we're recording this. And so it's available everywhere in bookstores and stuff at reasonable price, and walks you through the science of everything that I've said, gives you a lot of methods and then ways to get into more self-help. There's hundreds of ACT self-help books available and so forth, but also walks through the evidence on area after area after area of human functioning in ways hopefully it's not boring, and telling good stories and so forth, and coming at it in different ways shows that these principles are applicable to everything that human beings are facing. And so if you're wanting to work on behavior change, or you see things happening in your family or your community or neighborhood, your business, there's stuff in the book that you can use, and it'll help you maybe have a decoder ring for some things that are happening. Like if, mindfulness sounds a little too woo-woo to you, by the time you finish it, it won't,
Mm.
uh, etc. Some of the things that are happening in our culture that I think are positive, and give you
Mm.
kind of a read as to why these things are important.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
It was an awesome conversation, Liam, and thank you so much for the interesting questions at the end. I love the curveballs, but also for that kind of dance that you do with this evolutionary and evidence-based
Mm.
side. On the other hand, this human complexity side. And
Mm.
you're a fellow traveler. I'm glad to support your work, and if look forward to maybe having a conversation again sometime. But I'll definitely follow your work from here.
I'd love that. Yeah. Thank you so much.